Thanks. Unveiling BFADE, Bayesian fatigue model estimator overview of the software package and its software and its application to the probabilistic evaluation of LDAT curves. So thanks everybody for attending and thanks for this kind of introduction. Today I unveil my software package, BFADE, on which I've been working quite a bit. As the title suggests, this work was motivated by the need of evaluating LDAT curves probabilistically, but actually I came up with something promisingly extensible. Okay, we're going to be talking about Bayesian inference. And generally speaking, Bayesian inference about these two families of problem, regression and classification. In both cases, we wish to infer some trainable parameters given certain a priori knowledge. In regression, the parameters fit a model. In classification, they fit a decision boundary. We also need a likelihood of the data set and the evidence to build Bayes' theorem and infer the parameters through maximum a posteriori estimation. Why Bayesian inference on fatigue semi-empirical models? Because generally fatigue involves a small data regime which we can tolerate using our prior knowledge. As an extreme scenario, we can even build models whose dimensionality is higher than the size of the data set. This is the architecture of the package. The reddish block is the core of the abstractness. It offers very abstract classes to target regression and classification problems depending on selected fatigue problem. Provided that one replaces the abstract method with concrete methods. For instance, equation here is actually empty, but you can replace it with a straight line, parabola, Waller's curve, if you will. Similarly for predictor and the remainder of the method. Here I just reported the essential functions and method to present the general framework, but actually there are some other functions that aids visualization and other utilities as well. In this case, we provide equation with the LDAT curve and we concretize the other method to target Bayesian classification. Also, we subclass LDAT dataset from dataset to create an appropriate data structure for training later. Well, let's introduce the LDAT curve, which is a linear elastic fracture mechanics model that outlines the fatigue endurance limit of cracked or flawed materials, referred to a predefined runout threshold. Given these parameters, delta K, delta sigma sub W, the fatigue's endurance limit of a defect-free material, delta K THLC, the stress intensity factor range for long cracks, and Y, a factor depending on shape and location of defects. If these were known, we outline the region of propagating cracks and non-propagating cracks. And if we test other samples at different stress ranges with certain killer defect size, for instance, square root of area, failed and run out would be primarily collocated above and below the curve. But the problem is determining these parameters. While delta sigma, delta K THLC can be determined through fatigue crack growth test, although costly, delta sigma sub W is really hard to obtain because having a defect-free material is without altering the intrinsic microstructure is nearly feasible. So we wish to find the parameters just by using this data and possibly relevant information from the literature. As an additional requirement, the resulting LDAT curve must optimally separate the classes, fail and run out. To understand how, sorry, I skipped this part. Well, the BFADE accepts input data as CSV or spreadsheet files. Here we feed BFADE with fractography data, square root of area, and Y, and from the fatigue test, delta sigma, and whether or not a sample failed. Next, we create an LDAT data set to acquire, pre-process, and structure the data appropriately. And we can import a dedicated viewer to inspect this material data set, which accepts the material structures. And this is the data set. We'll do inference on this literature data set regarding a titanium alloy, additively manufactured, whose samples underwent constant stress fatigue amplitude test at stress ratio -1, and the fatigue endurance limit was referred to 10 million cycles. To understand how BFADE computes the log likelihood of the data set, we can invoke this mock L-Adult curve, which is generally unknown beforehand. The first stage involves calculating the signed distances between each data point to the curve, and these intermediate results can be shown here. After this stage, we can squash these distances to the logistic function to return probabilities, and we plug this result into Bernoulli log likelihood, since we are handling a classification problem. This is implemented in the software package when we borrow some function from a popular package, scikit-learn, it's a popular package for machine learning. And we can also display directly the likelihood with a dedicated base viewer. These 3 lines of codes instantiate a Gaussian prior for both parameters and combine them as independent distribution. As before, we can show the resulting distribution, which was shaped according to these references. That's how we inject prior knowledge into the training stage, and that is more evident here. The package assembles the log posterior, where we can see 2 competing factors: the log likelihood, which is the information content of the data set, and the log prior, which is our prior belief about the parameters. This is shown here through this simple command. And we just need to run maximum a posteriori, passing the data structure and an initial guess. In this case, the solver will start somewhere and converge to this stationary point here, the maximum, where the optimal parameters are located. At this point, the BFADE approximates the posterior distribution, not the log posterior, using a multivariate Gaussian distribution centered at the optimal estimate. This is variational inference. And we can display the joint distribution and the marginal distributions. The posterior distribution allows us to predict failure probabilities, and 2 methods are currently available. The first is frequentist and uses prediction interval where beta is a confidence level. We now focus on the joint distribution since correlation arose during the training. Otherwise, we would lose this correlation using marginals. To compute these intervals, we invoke this sampler implemented in BFADE, and we draw, say, 50,000 trials from the posterior, and after prescribing 99% confidence level, we can trigger the computation and display the results, or just trigger the computation and display it later. But in any case, this is the result. Our optimal estimates is the blue curve surrounded by the bounds, which represent the prediction interval. And we can see our optimal estimates optimally split the samples, leaving failed above and run out below it as desired. The bounds of the interval, given the prescribed confidence level, represent the fatigue endurance limit at 0.5 and 99.5% failure probabilities. So samples along these bounds would yield such failure probabilities. The orange curve is the curve taken from the referenced paper, and we can see that lays inside the bounds, so it's considered to be admissible in this case. Incidentally, the bounds narrows down where more information is available, while they widens towards the edges of the plot where information is missing. And that's kind of intuitive. The second method is rigorously Bayesian. This allows us to compute failure probability over an arbitrary domain, but it's more complicated. It requires calculating the predictive posterior, but this expression turns out to be numerically intractable, so I implemented this approximation. And now we can trigger the computation. This command is really flexible. This parameter can allows us to pass any NumPy callable function to post-process the samples from the predictive posterior. In this case, I used mean and standard deviation, but you can pass any, for instance, quartiles. We end up with two contours now, representing the crack propagation region probabilistically. And so for any point over this domain, we can formulate predictions about failure probability as mean plus minus uncertainty. And interestingly, there seems to be a certain equivalence between the methods. The contour and the cluster, in particular the class transitions between 1 and 0 takes place inside the bounds. The contour here is 1, the expected value is 1 red broken, 0 blue unbroken, and that corroborates the phenomenological behavior of the Eladad curve. Wrapping up, I walk you through the application programming interface of this software package, which is tailored for Bayesian inference on semi-empirical fatigue model. It's open source, extensible, with human-friendly commands. I benchmark this package against the identification of the Eladad curves encompassing data processing, core computation, plotting utilities. Developments are foreseen, such as implementing framework for Bayesian regression, and maybe a graphical user interface. This is the link to the preprint, my GitHub repo, our contacts, and I acknowledge the funding source of this project. I'm gonna stop there and glad to address your queries.